screams in the night. Indian legends. Miles of footprints. Sightings. What are these elusive hominids that stalk the wilderness? Join us for eyewitness accounts, questions and answers, Bigfoot encounters of the past, and ongoing encounters in the present. Your host, two-time witness, field researcher for 43 years, William Jevning. Welcome to the mystery. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Creek Devil. We have Roy with us this morning from Montana. Roy, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm good. Now for those who may not remember, we had interviewed Roy's father some time ago, and you had actually walked into the room and he handed you the phone, so it's really great to be able to talk to you about things going on there. So I know you just spoke with Tom, so Tom, I'm going to let you kick this off.
Yeah, real good. Hey, Roy, how's it going?
Good.
Excellent. So just kind of a real quick recap here. Roy contacted us, and you've got some thermal images that you took, and I'm not going to give the location away, but it's somewhere in the state of Montana. And so maybe walk this through a little bit. You've got some pictures that you took of this thing. Were you camping? Fill us in. How'd this come about?
So, no, actually, one of my buddies, he ran across a couple of YouTube things about Sasquatch and was asking me, because he knows I've seen one. And so, and I've been doing, I guess you could say, some research up there. I've been going and looking for footprints and trying to see how they move and stuff to find out more about them. And so I told him I would take him up with the thermal, and because I knew every time I've gone up, something's happened. So I knew that we would get an image of one moving across somewhere. And sure enough, we go up. We spent about an hour up there, didn't see anything, and then on our way down, I stopped in the spot where my dad had seen one when we were camping, standing right about 70 yards away from him out in the open. And that, where you can see on the thermal, is about 70 yards to the right of where he's seen one when we were camping. And I was scanning across, and black is hot, and I seen it move, and so I went back to it, and it was sitting there like swaying back and forth clearly. And I was like, so I got everybody out of the truck to look at it. And then on the thermal, you can take pictures of it. So I snapped those pictures, and I hope to go back up and maybe get some clear photos.
Hey, let me ask you. So it was swaying back and forth?
Yeah, a little bit. It does it a little bit to the right and then to the left. It was just kind of swaying. And that's what caught my eye, is the movement, because the wind wasn't blowing at all. Mm-hmm. That night, luckily. And I've learned with being out in the woods, instead of looking for a body figure, I look for movement in the brush.
Right, yeah.
And that's how I've caught most of them, is by looking for movement and not the silhouette.
So when you say that it was moving, was it like moving its arms, or was it moving its whole body?
Its whole body.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and that's why. And then it kind of moved down a little bit. And in picture number 5, you can see you can barely just see the tops of the shoulders and the head, mm-hmm. And that's because it kind of moved down. And when it did that, I was like, all right, we need to go.
Yeah.
Because we probably weren't 100 yards from it.
Right.
I think we were probably only like 70 yards.
Mm-hmm.
Were you, now that you may have said this already, but was this in the daytime, or was it dark out?
No, it was dark. It was probably 11 o'clock at night, midnight.
Okay.
And
wow.
I was the only one up there too, because like I said, we were driving all around on the road, and I didn't run across anybody up there. There was nobody camping because it was starting to get cold out.
Yeah, and you and I talked about this a little bit. The size, kind of maybe go into a little bit. You thought the shoulders themselves are minimum 4 to 5 feet.
Yeah, those are where it's at. The trees are pretty mature. I'd say each tree is 60, 70 feet tall. And so the tops of the trees are, a good 4 or 5 feet wide. And if you look, because it's standing right at the top of one, you can see that its shoulders as wide as the trees tops.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's a dead giveaway that I don't know anybody with shoulders that big.
No.
Somebody who's just going to be up in the middle of nowhere at midnight.
Well, and the swaying back and forth is, Will, is that correct? That's usually an indication of agitation with these things.
Yeah, and it's like most primates, when they sway back and forth, it's a clear indicator they're agitated.
Yeah.
Oh, I did not know that. That's good to know.
Hey, if you were to estimate, how tall do you think that it was?
Man, probably a good solid 9 to 10.
Wow. Okay.
And if you guys want, I can run up there one of these days and get pictures in the daytime and have somebody stand right where it was standing at.
That would actually be
because I know
great.
that location really well.
Yeah. No, that'd be fantastic. And, we talked a little bit before the show. You said that you had mentioned there's kind of a general feeling that the population is increasing, and a significant number of people, like you thought maybe even 1 in 10 in that area have had an encounter or know somebody personally who's had an encounter. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? And
yeah, so one of the reasons I think the population is growing. So where I saw that one at, it's on the Great Divide, like right towards the top of the Great Divide. So if you hop one ridge over, that's a completely different area. And I've had a buddy who's had an encounter in there, and it was totally different than anything we've ever gotten. So I really believe it. I call them clans, so I really believe it's not the same clan. And then so if you're going to the right, so one ridge over from that, so 2 ridges over where I got the pictures from, there's a pass there, and I've known 3 people who've had encounters on that pass. And fairly aggressive encounters, rocks getting chucked at them for a half an hour.
yeah,
So,
that's
not little rocks too, like baseball size.
Oh, really? So they're not being chucked?
Yeah,
thrown. Okay. Okay. And is this an area that's, I'm going to ask a rhetorical question, but pretty remote? And do you think these things are, I don't want to say isolated, but maybe not a lot of contact with people?
No, I think so. Like I said, I know that area like the back of my hand. This summer, I went 4-wheeling up there, and I would do 80 miles at a time up there. And that's not including all the times I've snowmobiled up there. So like I said, I know the area super well. And with how I found that they move, I believe there's 3 to 4 of them in that clan. And on that mountain where I got the pictures at, I call that their home base. It seems like in the evenings or right before dawn, they're always there. Or if you go up at random times, they're usually sitting there. And the closest houses from there are maybe a quarter mile away down the gulch. But that's a pretty main snowmobile area up there where they're at. But I also believe that they use the mine shafts as in the wintertime to keep warm, because that mountain is just like Swiss cheese with mine shafts.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask. Do you think that they had, like, there are caves there that they use maybe?
I don't think caves. I mean, these mines are big enough. There's some of them, the entrances you could pull a car into.
Gotcha.
So, I mean, they're pretty good-sized mines. And like I said, a lot of them interconnect because it was the same mining company that owned them. And so I believe they use those in the wintertime. But I've also noticed, too, and I don't know if you guys have heard this or not, but there's a lot of huckleberries up there, and I love to go berry picking. And I noticed they follow the huckleberries when it's in season.
Mm-hmm. That's
so
funny.
They'll start out low,
that.
And then towards the end of the season, they'll be moved up way on top.
Yeah, I've experienced that here in Oregon as well. That's interesting. Now, excuse me, are the mine shafts abandoned or any of them active?
No, they're all abandoned. They were from the early 1900s.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
And we like to go exploring a lot of the abandoned mines around here too, because you can get dynamite boxes out of them, old shovels and stuff, some stuff that's worth a little bit of money. And so we know about most of the mines on there, but we've probably spent, total. I don't even know how many hours on that mountain, and I'd say we've only found about half of them.
Wow. Okay.
Hey, do you think that these are the same, like the same group of creatures, or do you think that it might be a different group each year?
No, I definitely believe it's the same group on that mountain because, like I said, they always use it like a home base. After I talked to you guys, I've gone up there a couple times when it was all. So in the wintertime, they groom the road up the gulch for snowmobiles, so you can only park at the parking area. And I've gone a couple times up 11 o'clock, midnight, up there and parked just to see if they were around. And I went up once with my dad, and he ended up doing like a whoop. And then about 10 minutes later, we heard a tree knock, and this dog by the house at the parking area just went ballistic. And I ended up counting 2 of them on the thermals. And I've learned they hide so well. You can't see them with the night vision. I've tried night vision, and you cannot see them with the night vision. The thermal is the only way. Yeah. Because they can't hide their bodies.
Okay, so talk to me a little bit about why you can't see them with night vision, but you can with thermals. So you scan with night vision, and you just get, the forest, trees, trunks, and that sort of thing. And I kind of know what you're talking about. Night vision is great because you can see, but it has that kind of a two-dimensional feel to it, doesn't it?
Yeah,
kind
and
of
we
flat.
have pretty good night vision, but they hide behind bushes and trees. I've watched one in the thermal turn sideways, so it could hide behind the tree.
Okay, so with the thermal, for example, if it's hiding behind some bushes, you've got thermals that are capable of detecting that additional radiation from their body through the bush? Okay.
Yeah, through the bush. They're so big and they give off so much heat that there's just no way of hiding that.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. Okay. And, I was going to ask you, if they're up there, you said your dad, you or somebody did a wood knock, and then they got a vocalization in a response. Anything else, like whistles or shrieks or screams or anything like that people have reported hearing?
My dad's heard a ton of their owl sounds that they do, try to sound like an owl.
Right.
And he's heard tons of those, and you can tell because it sounds like an 800-pound owl sitting there.
Yes,
and it's just over and over and over. Tons of that. And why I said that I believe there's 2 clans is because the vocalizations we usually get are like that. And I've only heard about 3 tree knocks from that clan. Now, one ridge over, my buddy was camping, and I told you guys the story, and they ended up getting run out in the middle of the night because they were starting to circle their camp, and they were sleeping in their cars. And he said when they put the fire out and were laying in the cars, they could hear them walking between the cars and on the outskirts of the camp. And he's like, it was freaking me out because every time I'd shine the flashlight, there'd be nothing there. And he said when they had the fire going and were sitting around the fire, he heard whistling all over the place. He counted 4 for sure.
Okay.
Sitting whistling back and forth.
Wow. Yeah, so they were kind of surrounded the area then, right?
Yeah, they surrounded like their whole camp because they were up there just, not paying attention. And then he started hearing the whistling, and then pine cones started coming in. And then they realized that they were getting surrounded.
Yeah.
So, and like I said, from that group is totally different from the encounters I've had with the other group. And that's why I believe there's 2 different groups there.
Yeah, one question I have, when, like, you hear rocks being thrown at you and others, do you think that they're doing it as kind of a warning, or are they actually trying to hit you and they just miss?
I haven't had a rock thrown at me, luckily, yet. I think I really go off by the size of the rocks. I think if they're, just want to grab your attention, they'll throw little ones. Because, like I said, they're throwing pine cones. But when my buddy who had that same encounter there, when he was with his brother, one ridge over, and they had one throwing rocks at him for like a half an hour. He said they were baseball-sized rocks, and he's like, they weren't coming, he wasn't just lobbing them. He's like, whatever was throwing them as hard as they could.
Oh, okay.
And they stuck around?
It was down the hill a little bit, and it's a pretty steep hill, and this thing was throwing these rocks quite a ways.
So, did they eventually decide to leave?
So they sat there for, like I said, about a half an hour until it finally, I guess he said they could hear it walk off. The rock stopped, and then they could hear it walk off, and then they booked it down the hill to the car because the car was only probably 200, 300 yards away from where they were at. But
let me ask you. The people in that neighborhood or whatever, had you ever heard any stories about this creature beforehand, or was this kind of your first experience with this?
This is like my first experience. How we came about them is because the hill they live on is right next to one of our favorite camping spots, and so last summer my dad and I did quite a bit of camping up there. And like I said, every time we go up there, we'd either hear hoots. He heard what sounded like a baby crying one time on the hill.
Mm-hmm.
We had, every time we went up there, something would happen, and it's like clockwork.
So let me back up for a second. We've heard that before, people talking about hearing like a baby crying or a kid, and it's in an area that it just doesn't make sense. Is that it's kind of how this situation is? It's like, now there's no baby up there, or?
Yeah. The only path/road onto that hill is right through the campsite, like right next to it. So if anybody was up there, you'd know about it because it would have to go right through your camp.
Yeah.
And it, like I said, in the wintertime, there's definitely a lot more people up there just because it's a main snowmobile route through there. And I've noticed in the wintertime they really hunker down on that hill because there's no snowmobile trails on that hill. So not a lot of people go there. And it's right at the beginning of the main trail. So everybody just passes it.
Interesting. Hey, Will, have we heard other people, or have you heard of people describing like crying or baby sounds that these things make?
Yeah, I've heard it once or twice, not real often, but on a couple occasions, it's probably mimicking.
Yeah. I remember, I think Lee talked about it one time as well, and he heard something like that.
And see, about 2 days, a day before he heard that, we had my nieces and nephews up there, and they're still pretty little. And so I think that it was trying to mimic them.
Interesting. Yeah. And Will, by the way, because he's talking about Montana. Is there a lot of activity in Montana that you've heard about?
Yeah, it's a pretty active area. I guess not much more than, normal places in the Northwest and the western part of the country, but yeah, it's pretty active. But that could be because there's not as many people as other places to, have those encounters.
Right. Yeah.
I was going to ask you a question and see what you guys kind of thought. I got it written down here. Oh, so I've come up with the theory that, because my dad was like, how could we coax one out to see it? And I've learned these things always stay to the shadows no matter what. They always have cover. And I got thinking about it. I was like, man, the only way to get one out in the open, I think, is if you started feeding them, which in my mind has really bad if you stop, you're in trouble if you start feeding them. And I was just seeing what you guys thought on that. If that would be a good way to get one out in the open is to feed them.
You don't want to start feeding them. What you mentioned is exactly correct. If you stop, then there could be a lot of trouble.
And I really believe, so I have a diesel truck, and I'm really starting to think that they know my truck.
That's actually a really good question. Will, what do you think that they can actually get to the point, probably quickly, where they recognize a specific vehicle and specific people in an area?
That is correct. They do. If you go in there repeatedly, they will get to know your face and your vehicle and the sound of your vehicle, so they'll know it's you.
Yeah. And Will, by the way, too, I mean, because we've talked before about how their range is, I think you said like 500 miles, and they can come back and they can recognize instantly, like a truck or a sign or something like that. So they're very, very intelligent.
Yes, extremely so, and they're very intimate in the knowledge of their areas throughout their ranges. So if something is different there, or if somebody is there, they're keenly aware of that.
And they can recognize like dogs and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Well, I was going to comment, it really makes sense that they have that ability because, anybody who owns a dog or even a cat knows that that animal knows when your car comes home. So if something that has the intelligence of a dog can do it, these things, which are primates, it just stands to reason they just have that much more of an ability.
Yeah, exactly. I know when I used to visit my parents' home when I was stationed at Fort Lewis, my mom always knew when I was coming home because my dog would hear my pickup more than a mile away, and he'd start barking. She always knew when I was coming because the dog would bark.
Hey, Will, I have a question. Kind of on that note a little bit, but because we always think of these things as being like one group, and obviously we know there, different types and everything like that. But do you think that one of them would possibly like attack like another young one, different group and everything? But I mean, like, if it's vulnerable, would they attack that and eat that?
Well, it's certainly possible. I mean, primates typically are very territorial, and if there was something, one, say, from an outside group, we don't know, but it's very possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, we think of these things as like one species, but actually they're different families and different groups and everything. So it just seems like kind of likely that if they saw a young, vulnerable one, that they would probably attack it and eat it. But who knows? I mean, who knows?
And when you look at other primate groups, typically, and not just primates, a lot of animal species, if a male comes along and this young one or young ones are not its offspring, they oftentimes are attacked and killed, and that's kind of a mechanism to keep your genes, moving from one generation to the next, is by killing off ones that don't belong to you. It's kind of gruesome sounding, but it's a fact of nature. So would these things do it? Possibly. We just don't know.
Right.
I was going to ask Will if you've noticed this, but when they move to different areas, I notice they don't go like on top of the ridge tops. They stay in about the middle of the mountain and cut across. Have you noticed that?
It really depends on the group and the terrain. I've seen them in all kinds of different locations and moving, from one area to the next feeding. So it really terrain dictates that movement.
Okay. Because up there, I've always noticed whenever I catch him, it's always about halfway up the mountain.
In that location, what's the visibility like down below?
Fairly poor just because of all the trees. And this one main trail they use, it was an old mining trail, and it's not quite wide enough for a car. And there's a bunch of trees overgrown now. And I've noticed when you're on that trail, and if someone's down at the road, they can't see you, but you can see them. And I've noticed that's like their favorite trail to take. And that trail goes all the way around. I mean, it wraps around probably close to 10 miles.
Okay, that's probably your answer right there. If they have good visibility, they'll use landmarks to navigate by going large distances. But since they have the trail in that particular location that offers that concealment, and it's a nice, easy pathway, that's why they're using it in that particular location.
Okay, that's kind of what I was thinking.
Hey, Will, this is kind of a question for, actually for all of you, I guess, but when you have an encounter, do they actually growl? I mean, do they breathe heavy? Or, what's your kind of experience like with them, like maybe growling or whatever?
Well, it just depends on the individual and what's going on. I mean, I was growled at once. I know other people have been growled at multiple times in areas, hunters. Many people, not at all. It really depends on the circumstances of what they're doing and what you're doing.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, though. And I would assume that a growl is a challenge or a warning. Would you agree?
I'll tell you what, the one time I was growled at, I felt like it was a warning. And I made a quick retreat from that spot.
And I imagine, excuse me, that they probably, when they do growl at people, they get that response. And so they know, all I got to do is, if I want this person to leave, I growl at them.
I tell you what, it's a very unnerving experience. So it's not something like you're going to stand there and think, oh, what is that? Your instant response, it's almost an autonomic response, is to get the hell out of that spot.
Yeah. And of course they mimic a lot of like animal, like he was saying, like, whether it's owls or even cats or dogs, they mimic those sounds. So,
yeah, that's where we get that report a lot.
Yeah.
And native people said that also.
Yeah.
I was going to add.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, I was going to add, one of the reasons I think they throw things at people is because they're trying to see if you know that they're there. Because I've noticed when they know that you know that they're there, it's totally different than if you're just walking around and have no idea that they're there.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, the behavior does change. And it's not a bad idea to sort of let them be aware that you're aware of them, but don't focus on them being there. If you talked about wanting to have one come out, the quickest way is to ignore them. But they know that you're aware of them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think that sometimes they probably just want you to be aware that they're here and they know that you're here. So they probably just kind of want you to get the hell out. But
now it depends on the demeanor of the rock throwing too. Like you mentioned, if it's pine cones and smaller rocks, it's not a real aggressive type throwing. That could be something they're trying to do, is to elicit a response like, hey, we're over here, be aware of that. If it's a more aggressive rock throwing, let's say, baseball or cantaloupe size rocks, and they're coming in with some force, they're not happy that you're there, so you want to get out of that area. You're in the wrong place.
Yeah. Hey, Will, so here's kind of a random question, but since you've been tracking footprints, and obviously we know that they're different types and everything, but have the footprints changed over time, or have they gotten bigger, smaller, or like just different in nature? Or
no, footprints are one of the constants. You can go back now. We have examples of footprints from at least photographically since the 1930s, maybe longer. I'd have to go back and research it a bit, but I know for sure the 30s. 1934 was one photograph. Thousands of footprints from all over the place. I mean, literally everywhere. And they don't change. That's one of the constants. You get variation between individuals, as one would expect, but in terms of size, shape, etc., they're the same.
Yeah. I mean, have you ever tracked a print that, like, you knew it was a juvenile and then it got bigger and you could tell it's the same one, or?
We do see that occasionally, but most often you're going to find the adults out on the outside edges of their feeding areas. So,
right.
Yeah. And I typically don't do a great deal of penetrating those areas. If I know where they're feeding, I try to observe what's going on from the outer edges of that and try not to get in the inside. But some places, some investigations, we've been able to go into the areas that were active at night and find different footprints and different behaviors. But, we respected those boundaries and stayed out of those areas at night when they were in there. And they seem to be okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to back up for a second. I found it interesting. I didn't realize that there was footprints going back to the 30s. I kind of thought this whole thing, at least for the majority of the people, the whole story, I guess, broke open in the 50s, but it actually goes back earlier than that. So can you... Where were those photographs? What state? Was it California or just curious?
Well, there was a photograph in one of John Green's, I think it was John Green's first book on the track of the Sasquatch. And the photograph was from, I believe it was Northern California. I'd have to go back and see. Sorry about that on the detail, but the photograph was taken by a gentleman named Dave Zebo. It was in 1934 and the tracks were in the snow.
Wow. Okay. And I'm just, I try to put myself in the mind of the person taking that picture and what were they thinking? Because, they didn't quite have the knowledge that we have of these things today. Do you think they knew that it was what made the footprints? I'm going in the realm of speculation, I realize.
Yeah, I think they must have known it was something not human, obviously. Sorry, I was trying to look up that reference to see if there was any information.
Well, just a question. Before you met John Green and Renee, how much knowledge did they have about this creature? Like before you met them? I mean, so you saw the tracks in the snow and everything, but did they actually know exactly what that was?
Oh, yeah. Well, these Green and Hendon had been involved in this since the late 1950s. So by the time I met them in 1975, they had known quite a bit. I mean, they'd already been through most of this stuff. So, yeah, they were very familiar with it.
Okay, yeah, because I was just wondering, like, if you go back to like religious stories and like in Native American accounts and everything, obviously they knew that these things existed way before than the Patterson film,
Well, and largely they were responsible for Patterson being in that location and getting the film.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, they were very knowledgeable about all of that. Sorry, I'm a little tongue-tied there. Yeah, I'm going to have to look up that reference. I'm not seeing it. I don't want to sit here and, thumb through all these books.
I had a question for you guys, and see what you think. A lot of people said that, they think they hide their tracks, but I've noticed there's a lot of springs in that hill that mountain that they stay on. And I've noticed that they stay out of the muddy areas, and I think it's just because they don't like the feeling, the mud going between their toes, because then you get rocks and stuff.
That could very well be. I mean, it just depends. I mean, we don't know what's in their minds when they're going through these, when they're going through different areas. It could be they're trying to, or being aware of their footprints, and if they're not, well, I guess whether they are or not doesn't matter. It could be that, a lot of them just don't, like you said, don't like the feeling of that. They don't, I mean, if you have to live out in those environments, you probably don't want to go walking through, a foot of mud if you don't have to.
Yeah.
What kind of springs, Roy? Are they just like natural springs that, coming out of the mountain, or?
Yeah, a lot of them are natural. Some of them, they run out of the mine entrances.
Okay.
There's quite a few springs. I mean, I can count 4 to 5 of them that I know of. And so it gets pretty wet in the springtime when the water tables are starting to come up.
Right. So I'm assuming with these natural springs, they're going to be other animals are going to go there and drink and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, and that's one reason I think they chose that as their main staying place, is because I've noticed through that area, that's where the deer move more through, because they go down to right below this gulch is a little town, and they move through that area to go to that town to go eat more trees and flowers, people have around their houses.
Right.
Hey, fellas.
Well, yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I was just didn't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to kind of insert real quick the Dave Zebo photograph information. I did find it. The Humboldt Times in Eureka, November 18, 1960, carried a photograph taken by Zebo in Arcata in 1934 showing bipedal tracks, which he followed to the peak of a 6,900-foot Weaver Bali Mountain. They took strides up to 6 feet despite the deep snow and the steep slope. Sorry for the mistakes there, folks, but so that's the info on one of the earliest known photographs of footprints.
Wow. Well, that's interesting. I wish that guy was still around. It'd be interesting to talk to him and see what was in his mind.
And I did I did put the photograph in my first book, Notes from the Field, as well.
Oh, okay. Good.
Hey, Roy, I was going to ask, did you get any description of like the facial features of the creatures that you saw?
No, I couldn't see him well enough through the thermal. The one that my dad saw, he got really good facial descriptions of it, and he noticed that it didn't have a conical head, and that one in the thermal, it didn't look like to me that it had a conical head. And you see it, and he said too, he noticed that the head it looked really small for the body, and in those thermal pictures you can see how little the head is compared to the shoulders. So he thinks it's the same one that he saw. I'm not too sure because, like I said, I'm pretty sure there's 3 to 4 of them up there.
Right.
But I haven't seen the others. I've only seen just thermals of, of them. And
Yeah.
they're all about the same size from what I've seen.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I was going to mention, just going back real quick on the springs, is that could be an area of interest for them year-round because the spring typically isn't going to freeze even in the wintertime because you got movement in the water unless it just gets exceptionally cold. What are your thoughts on that? Do the springs freeze over, or do they...
Most of the springs up there, they either freeze over or else they dry up unless it's coming out of a mine. Then all you have to do is go 100 feet back where the air's warmer and the water's still flowing.
Okay, so at least they have
I
a
think that's
constant
one of
water
the reasons
source.
too. Yeah, they have a constant water source, and like I said, the deer I've noticed don't go up the gulch. They stop about at the campsite, and then they move between the campsite and the town, and that's it. They will not go above that gulch.
Okay, so they stay in the lower elevations, and they probably have a sense maybe that these things are up there.
And I think so, and I think that's one of the reasons they stay there, too, is because it is kind of close to that town up there. And I'm talking it's like 15, 20 people that live up there in this town. And I think that's one reason they stay there is because the deer are always around there. That's the only place I've ever seen deer up there.
Oh, okay. Interesting. And another thing I want to kind of back up on, get your comments on, are the huckleberries, because that's kind of a thing that I've sort of zeroed in on with some of them here in Oregon. So you say they kind of follow the harvest of the ripening of these things, so in other words, down in the lower elevations, the huckleberries do they ripen sooner or after than the ones in the higher elevation?
They usually ripen after because up in the higher elevations it gets colder. So the time for them to ripen, it seems like usually you have to catch them within like a 2-week period.
Yes. Right.
And I've noticed too, like I said, they go a lot further out. There's areas that I'll go that I've never had anything happen, and I'll start hearing something walking around. You can tell that they're there, you know what I mean? And so during the huckleberries, and that's why I believe they follow the huckleberries, is because I'll catch them in areas that I've never seen them in or heard them in.
Yeah. Hey, I was going to ask, do you ever hear, screams in your area? Screams or, shouts or things like that?
So right on the backside of where they live on that mountain, my dad was up there four-wheeling, and he heard a scream. I haven't heard a scream yet, and I don't know what's with that. He said it was quite a ways away. But one thing I do notice, too, is when they're there a lot more is people run cattle up there, and quite a bit of cattle, and they calve up there usually. And so I've noticed, and the cattle like to hang on the other side of that mountain because it drops down into a big meadow.
Oh, okay.
So I think that's one reason they stay there is just because the deer and the cattle, they have so much food. But then, like I said, when the huckleberries come in, they start moving around. They kind of follow the huckleberries. I know for a fact they have a sweet tooth.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I get that. So do you know any of the ranchers who have cattle? I'm just curious if there's any reports of calves or cows being killed or mutilated or, attacked by these things.
I've seen dead cows up there. I've been trying to find the ranchers and ask them that because I'm kind of interested. I'd like to see, how many calves he loses in a season up there. See if it's more than normal. But I haven't been able to find out who runs the cows up there.
Right. So you've seen dead cows up there?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you notice? Okay. Did you notice any of the, like was it torn open? Was it feasted on? And I just wonder if you'd noticed anything like that.
The ones I've seen, they were fairly decayed, but it was mostly the stomach and then the back hindquarters that were gone.
Okay, interesting.
But I've found quite a few cow skulls up there too, wandering around.
Are the cow skulls just by themselves, or are they with one of the dead cows?
No, they're usually always by themselves.
Okay. And I'm going to zero in on that a little bit because I found, and we've talked about this before, Will, where it's possible that sometimes they'll use that for baiting.
Yeah, it's possible. I wanted to mention something too, or ask something. You said the cows typically stay on the other side of the mountain from where these things are active. Is that correct?
Yeah, so when you start up the gulch about a quarter mile on the left-hand side, that's where I call it their home base is. And it's a big, finger all the way up to the top of the divide. And then if you take a left on the back side of that, it drops down into a big meadow.
Oh, I see. Okay, so they know they have a good vantage point of the pasture down there and the cattle.
Oh, yeah, and I think one of the reasons, too, they stay there is because it's at the beginning of the gulch, so they know who goes in and out. Because you can't get up there unless you go through that area or you go on the, 40 miles away, and then it's like a 30-mile back road trip up to there, to that spot. Because there's roads all over the continental divide. I can start out here and make it 50 miles to Butte just in back roads.
So they have pretty good vision. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, from that point, yeah. On top of that, they can see both sides of where people are coming in and that whole meadow. And it's a good-sized meadow. It's probably a mile wide by 2 miles long.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, that is good size. In the meadow, do you ever see any evidence, footprints or anything that they've been in the meadow, or do they just kind of hang out in the tree line and inside the woods?
In the summertime, they usually stayed towards the bottom of the meadow. It starts getting a lot of timber in there, and I've noticed that's where they hang out in there, and I think they're waiting for deer to cross the meadow or something. But in the wintertime, all that gets drifted in, so there'll be 6-7 feet of snow in there. And so in the wintertime, okay. I've noticed they don't go in there really.
Right, no
Although
reason to.
I was snowmobiling down there once, and when I went on this trail to get to a different part, and when I came back, there was a log pulled over the trail.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and the spot, it's in the bottom of the meadow where it's real thick in timber, too. And I noticed, I was looking around one day, and it looks like they almost have blinds set up in there. Like, you can tell that trees have been stacked. Not just fallen over, but literally stacked.
Well, like they've manipulated, manipulated the trees. Does it look like they're creating a kill zone or a blind, do you think, to hide in?
I think a kill zone, honestly, because it's always on the either side of this trail. And it's a snowmobile trail, but I noticed in the summertime a lot of the cows use it and a lot of the deer and rabbits use this trail through there.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was asking because that's something we've heard before. They definitely manipulate their environment to create a kill zone, and that makes sense. I mean, it's less energy to get their food source.
Yeah. So Roy, I was going to ask, have you been since then, or afterwards, or?
After the thermal images?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I have. I went up there, I think, twice after that, and now it's so snowed in that it's only snowmobile in, and I was going to do that if I'm not working. I work construction, so I'm seasonal. So if we weren't working this week, I was going to go out there and look for footprints and see kind of where they've been.
Right. Yeah, gotcha.
And during the holiday season, everybody's kind of been out of there. No one's really been going in. And now that it's snowed in,
Exactly.
it's snowmobile access only, but there's not enough snow to attract a lot of snowmobilers up there. So I think there should be a lot of movement up there just because nobody's really been up there.
Yeah.
But when my dad heard that scream down on the bottom of that big meadow, there was cows down there, and he said the cows just went nuts after that.
Oh, yeah.
So that's one of the reasons I think they use the cattle as a feed source too. And I'm not talking like 30 head. This guy probably runs 500-600 head up there or more.
Yeah,
that'd be a real good food source. And Will, you talked about when you're a kid, wasn't there a time on your own farm when the cows, you came home and they're all sort of bunched up, or they're in the barn, kind of skittish over something out in the forest?
Yeah, this was back around 1968 when I was 10. The cows were all in the barn with their heads sticking out in their ears, very intently watching the tree line. And then my mom called me over to look, and there was something really big at the tree line. We couldn't see it because of the very, very thick foliage, but it was just thrashing the hell out of the brush at the edge. So I knew it wasn't a bear. I mean, at that age, I knew what had run into a bear earlier, so I knew they weren't doing that exact kind of behavior. But they were pretty scared, and they shouldn't have been there at that time of day.
Yeah. And of course, Willie was a great colleague. So he would tell you if there was something out there, like So yeah. So Willie, right?
Well, he was later. We got him in 1970 after we moved from that location. But I did have another collie before that at that location who was, the dogs. They pretty much stayed around the house when we lived back there. They didn't really, unless they were going with the kids out in the fields. Our dog didn't really go out there venturing by himself much. And I never really thought about it as a kid, but he always stayed near the house.
But what was so interesting about Willie, though, is that he ran to the fence line, the tree line, and he knew that, I have to go back, And then I guess that's when you had your encounter. But
it wasn't so much he had to go back. I watched him. He always, if I told him, hey, let's go, he'd always be out 100 feet or so in front of me, and he ran up to the tree line and he froze, and it was a very like a very tense posture, and then he turned around really quickly and ran back past me at top speed. So he was pretty spooked by whatever was there. And then, of course, I ran into those two.
Yeah. Hey, so
real quick, I'll
go ahead.
Sorry. Real quick, I'll add this. Speaking of dogs, I've started taking dogs up with me when I go. And a lot of people might get mad at this, but I always take them off leash because I've learned that dogs will let you know what's around the corner before you get there. Because, like Will said, my dogs are always 100 feet in front of me or so.
Yeah.
And they'll pause instantly and the hair stands up.
No, you're right. A dog's a great early warning device.
And I've learned that that's about the best warning advice for knowing when these things are around.
Yeah, absolutely. They know when something's around that, and will give you that warning.
Hey, Will, so has the Fish and Wildlife Agency ever commented on this subject, or are they just trying to stay away from it?
Well, I think like most agencies, they don't take an official stand because they don't want throngs of, people that are would-be investigators or looky-loos or what have you, overflowing an area, or an I told you so kind of situation or what have you. I'm sure it's much better to take a non-stance than it is to try to support or debunk anything like this.
Yeah, because I'm sure that they probably know about the subject, but they, like you said, they're just trying not to say anything about it, you know. So.
Yeah, it's just good official policy to not get involved in something that's not yet proven, you know, because it's just bad management on their part if they were to.
Yeah.
And I kind of think it's the reputation of the game warden, too. I know the guy, the main game warden that flies up here, he flies a helicopter and counts all the animals and gets numbers. And I kind of was poking around, seeing what he thought and seeing if he's ever seen anything weird. And all he said is, I've seen things that you wouldn't believe, but I'll leave it at that.
You know, I've actually heard that from a few officials, quote unquote. And that's kind of the way it is. You know, they may or may not know, but if they do, they're not going to say a whole lot.
Yeah.
Well, fellas, we're starting to run a little short on time. Any final thoughts or questions?
I just want to thank Roy for coming on and sharing the experience, and yeah, so just thanks, and Happy New Year to everybody.
And again, I want to say the same thing. Ditto what Brian said. Roy, thanks for coming on, and please stay in touch. You know, keep us updated with, as you have new encounters and new information. You know how to get a hold of us. So, don't be a stranger.
Yeah, Roy.
Oh, I definitely will, and thank you. Sorry.
And I'm sorry. We are planning to come there this summer, most likely. So. That's all I'm going to say about that for the moment, but stay in touch and we'll keep you informed about what our plans are. So we have some big operations coming up.
Okay, I definitely will. And if you guys let me know ahead of time, I'll gather all the people I've known who's had encounters around here.
Okay.
And so you guys can get their eyewitness testimony, and I'll take you around to all these spots.
Okay, great. Roy, thank you so much, and everyone have a Happy New Year. We're going to take a short break, folks. Stand by. We'll be back in 3 minutes. I think it's 3 minutes. Well, welcome back from the break, everyone. I can't never remember how long that little bridge music is there. I don't think it's 3 minutes. I think it's maybe 30 seconds. I can't remember, but that's the disadvantages of old age, is not keeping tabs on things like that. So let's go ahead and kick off the Q&A. We're going to do a little mixture today. We have questions, as always, but we also talked about doing some discussion on, everybody talks about evidence, and I think in terms of evidence, it's footprints and witness sightings. Now, while those are kind of the biggies, there are plenty of other forms of evidence of these creatures, and I put a lot of that in my last book titled Bigfoot Evidence, that you can get on Amazon if you're interested in that. So fellas, let's go ahead and jump into the questions, and then we'll just sort of, we'll play it by ear.
Well, just to start off with, how about like what you just said? What are the other types of evidence besides footprints and what everybody thinks of Bigfoot? Like what are some of the other questions or evidence that you might have?
Well, there's obvious ones. I mean, we hear a lot about hair samples, but there's also scat, there's handprints, and there's a whole number of things that we know and we don't know yet about how they manipulate vegetation in their environment. There's the rock stacking and piling. Now there's just anything that they do in nature that is, something attributed to them.
There's also the audible evidence as well that, that our previous guest Roy was talking about. So, the one that everybody's familiar with, most familiar would be, the whistle, a loud whistle at nighttime, and the screams. But those screams can be the long scream that is, or the howls. Those are two distinct different types of vocalizations. But there's also what we call the scream bark. It's just a roar. And, that's something that, my wife and I heard earlier this year camping late in summer, 2 a.m. So, and then the owls, he mentioned owl sounds as well.
And
where you can tell it's not an owl.
Right. Here's one, too. And that's a great point, Tom, the audio. I hadn't even, heard that for so many years. I didn't even come on the list for the moment there. We did get some recent audio recordings from a gentleman, and I'm not going to go into that just yet, but we'll just say he's from Alaska, and he's had quite a lot of audio, and one of those clips of audio includes what sounds like gorilla chest beating. It's very clear.
That's, I had forgotten about that. I have heard, and I'm going to ask you, Will, I've heard, not as frequently, but I've heard a couple people talk about the gorilla chest beating. Have you heard that as well from witnesses?
I've heard it a few times, not a great deal. And I think, again, it goes back to there's these things that happen, in certain circumstances, and why things happen. This may be because there's, it's a remote location, and in those remote locations where there's less access to humans than, say, areas where we hear and see more things, and there's a little more aggressive behaviors. So what that indicates in that location, and without going too much into detail, there's a lot of aggressive behavior going on in that location. So the individuals that are there aren't very happy with the human presence. So we're just sort of monitoring that and seeing how that develops. But it does happen occasionally in other places. We don't hear a lot about it, though. But those are very, very clear recordings and very interesting. So I guess we can probably put those on the website.
Yeah. And, you talk about chest beating. That doesn't happen. You really, how can you hoax that? I mean, even a big guy out in the woods, when you hear these chest beatings, they're very deep, powerful, I guess is the word I'm looking for.
It's not a person doing it.
No, it's not a person doing it. And you know what? What on the North American continent does that?
And
we don't have gorillas.
And the only accessibility to that particular location is by boat. There are no roads there.
Right.
So Will, you think it's territorial, basically?
Partially. I mean, it's really, with these creatures, it's difficult to tell at this point because we've heard it so few times, or people talk about it so few times, that we don't really know what it's in relation to just yet.
Okay.
I guess we could compare it to gorillas doing it and why they would do it. And I'm not really sure why they do that. I haven't studied gorillas in depth, so I'd have to go back and see what, maybe Diane Fossey had to say, or other people that research gorillas as to why they would do that.
Well, and maybe this is a good opportunity to do a shout out to anybody in our audience that's a primatologist or somebody who works with primates. If you know the answer to that, shoot us an email, questions at creekdevil.com. We'd love to hear from you. We've had a few biologists give us some really excellent feedback on shows talking about behavior. So again, there's an invite if that's your field. Just give us a holler. Love to hear from you.
I guess I should mention too, since we had our good friend Tony on last week, who is an attorney and an active judge. So folks listening to that show, yes, he is an actual judge. So we're going to do a little spot occasionally with him, actually doing a deposition with witnesses. So he's very good at questioning. So that's an interesting little feature we're going to add to the show periodically.
Hey, so Will, I do have a question. because I know that we've talked before about the possibility and actually probability of them like inbreeding. But aside from that, though, how do you think that these creatures mate? Because it seems like there are not a lot to go around in certain areas. So how do they mate?
In terms of getting together, is that what you're meaning? Or I'm not going to go into the physical part of that.
No, I mean, like, how do they find each other? Okay, yeah, politically incorrect. Okay, how do they find each other to have groups to mate?
Well, I'm sure they don't have BigfootMatch.com, but
yeah.
Sorry about that. I couldn't resist. You know, they're pretty aware of where each other are because they are territorial, and they do have the one example I know of in southern Washington where there are three groups. The two main or two homogeneous groups, you know, that stay together all the time, you know, are fairly distant from one another, so they don't really come together that we know of. But there is a group of three males that sort of hang around in between those groups, and occasionally one or more of those will split off and they'll temporarily join them other groups. So whether that's for breeding, we don't know, but it's a good guess.
But do you think that like inbreeding is like possible with these groups?
Well, it's always possible, but I doubt that it happens. I don't, you know, they have plenty of opportunity to, you know, have access to females or males, as it were, in other groups. And the groups will temporarily bond together.
Yeah.
So I've got a real good question and this guy writes us frequently, and he has really good questions. So quick shout out to Chad, and thank you, Chad. He's got a couple of questions for Will. Number one, question one is, did Rene DeHenden, did he ever have an eyewitness of his own encounter?
No. Hi, Chad. No, DeHenden never saw one himself.
Okay, that was kind of my understanding. And then he goes into evidences. What types of evidence has he found besides footprints? And then also, and I like this question, what's the most urban Sasquatch encounter that you've come across either yourself or through interviews? Do any encounters take place in a Walmart parking lot or a large housing tract with dogs and cars?
Well, they're in the Walmart parking lot. That's a question up in the air because, you know, I guess how would you distinguish between a shopper and a Bigfoot? Sorry, Walmart shoppers. I couldn't resist that. Let's see. Let's go back to the first question.
Okay, so he wanted to know what types of evidence outside of footprints have their and again also this
was this
so
we're
that's
talking to
question.
Hendon, right? What he found.
Yeah, right.
Well, Rene wasn't a great sharer of information. He did particular things, I know in my case, trying to teach me things, but he didn't go into great detail. A lot of it he wanted me to find on my own, and I would come back and discuss things with him. However, there were things that were questions in his mind, like the rock stacks and piles. Now, he was the one who discovered a lot of those after the first incident with the Glenn Thomas story. And so I went not just to the places that he found that were outside of that particular location, but I have encountered some of that on my own through witnesses and other places. So what that indicates yet, we don't know. We think it's a form of tool use because whenever anything is manipulated, you know, objects manipulated for whatever purpose in an environment, that's a form of tool use. So we get, like when we talked about forms of evidence other than, you know, footprints and stories, how they manipulate objects in their environment, whether it's vegetation, trees, rocks, what have you, that's all considered tool use. So,
Well, and I just want to say on the rock stacks, we're not talking about the rock cairns, that hikers create for marking trails and stuff. We're talking big rocks that a human could never pick up.
We're talking 50 to 100-pound rocks, and they're very remote. They're never near where humans are. So when you go to these places, they're cross country through the forest. There is absolutely no human access to these places. So it's not something that a person would casually go up to an area and create.
Yeah, interesting. And I want to just kind of touch a little more on Chad's question. What's the most urban Sasquatch encounter that you've heard of?
Well, I guess what are we talking about by urban?
I don't know. So I guess, Chad, here we go. I'm going to jump in and kind of help interpret your question. We know people get a lot of encounters in the wilderness, but what about on the periphery of, say, towns, maybe small towns, or near civilization, people's houses?
I would have to reclassify that as suburban areas.
Okay.
Now, where I grew up would have been considered a suburban area, because it was farming area largely. There was a fair amount of space between homes. Was not urban. But I guess it wasn't really neighborhoods, quote unquote, either, like what you think of as suburban areas.
Okay.
Well, rural. It was rural. I guess everybody's got a different title they put on something, but if we're talking where Sasquatch activity is near human habitations, it would be more of those rural or suburban type places where there's not a great deal of people and there's access to them.
Okay, and I'm going to kind of interpret. He might be going in this direction, and that is, 3-4 years ago, there was a guy who was writing about these things actually being really within urban areas. Like there were some railroad tracks that went into town, and down by the trestle, quote unquote, he had found evidence, and excuse me, even a highway where he found evidence, and this is a well-frequented highway. So is that a myth, or is that something we can dispel, or is that any thoughts on that?
Well, I'd have to see what, quote unquote, evidence there was to support that. I think it's unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's not real likely either. Now, as with everything, including ourselves, you can't put behaviors in boxes where there's finite boundaries. You can make generalities about those behaviors, but there's always, exceptions. So are these cases, if they're legitimate exceptions? Probably. It's not the norm.
Right.
Well, and just to follow up on that, and this is what you've mentioned, is 98% of the time when you see one of these things, it's looking for food. So all their behavior, would you agree, is mainly food related, or looking for food?
Yes. No, and if they're actually happening in locations like this, there would have to be, a readily available food source to where they would take that chance, going through a heavily human habitated area to get that. And there would have to be, there'd have to be routes of concealment and things like that, because they're not just going to go walking in there when there's food available easier in other locations. So it would have to be an advantage to doing that.
Right.
So I think that kind of rules out the dumpsters at Walmart parking lots.
Yes, but they will go into dumpsters in other areas, where maybe it's a little more remote, smaller communities, things like that.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, and again, I'm just going to comment on the area that I'm familiar with here in Oregon, towards the coast. There's actually a real problem with bears, black bears, we don't have grizzlies, going into people's backyards and into, camping areas, dumpsters. And now there's reports of these things going into certain areas. And I've looked at the area. There's a lot of concealment for them to come in from a national forest, kind of do their thing and then book it right back and disappear again.
Yeah, I've had reports from people from back in the 50s and 60s where these things would go into, campgrounds and places like lakes, where there were dumpsters or trash facilities and rummage through the garbage.
What about, we hear reports of these things going into rural areas and raiding either somebody's, they hang the meat, the deer, in the shed, or even attacking live chickens, stealing chickens from the chicken coop.
Oh, yeah, lots of those reports. In fact, one of them that sticks out in my mind was a gentleman I ran across in southern Washington back in the late 80s, and he told me about, this guy was a former Marine Corps intelligence officer, so he was a pretty legitimate individual, and he told me about his neighbor. And his neighbor had a shed. He was an avid hunter, and he had this shed that he would hang deer and elk meat in there to cure. And these things, like clockwork, every year during hunting season would come in there, and they would attempt to get in that shed. And I believe it was the gentleman's son, a teenager, went out on the porch to see what the racket was one time and saw this whole group of these things, 4 or 5 of them really agitated because they couldn't get into this shed that was locked and fairly sturdy, but they would attempt to get in there every single hunting season.
Well, that begs the question, because I don't know that these things use smell. I think their primary sense is sight. So that begs the question, how did they know the meat was in there? They must have witnessed. They must have watched.
Well, that particular group is the one that I followed for a decade, more than a decade. And they were in that part of their range every single year at that time. So, sure, they were around watching what was going on. And I'm sure saw him, put that meat in there.
Wow, that's a bit unnerving. And it would also be unnerving to be the kid to go out on the porch and see not one but a group of these things agitated that they can't get into the meat locker.
Oh yeah, and the gentleman I spoke with about this, I didn't talk to the actual witness. He tried to get the guy to talk to me, but he wouldn't. He just didn't want to acknowledge what was happening there. But the former Marine Corps intelligence officer himself, that's how our conversation started. I happened to run across him one day, just kind of doing a survey of that area, and we struck up a conversation, and he told me that he was driving out early one morning, where out of his driveway to where the road was, and there were some fields around there, mostly heavily timbered, but there were some fields right near the road, and he saw one morning walking along the tree line, and it was very near that person's property, his neighbor.
Yeah, that's got to be a little bit unnerving.
The locals in Skamania County are most of them are very aware of these things are around there, and lots of people that have seen them.
Hey, Will, I was going to ask, how many misidentifications are there, do you think, with black bears and these things? And not particularly like here in Orlando, but I mean like in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, how often do you think that they kind of get misidentified?
Oh, I think it's plenty. And it could be the other way around, too. I mean, people may think they see a Bigfoot and it's actually a bear. It's really difficult to tell the number, of course, because you don't know what the person actually saw.
Right.
You can get clues from descriptions, and if you actually go do search the area, of course. But it happens, sure.
Yeah, because I mean, you can see black bears walking on 2 feet, and people probably assume that, oh well, it must be Bigfoot, but it's probably just a black bear. But
well, you're not going to see a black bear walk very far on 2 feet. It's not like the way a Bigfoot walks.
Right, but you could tell that a lot of people probably get confused.
I do want to jump in and say that black bears typically eat the big ones. The really big ones are 300 pounds. So they're really small. And then their stature, their physical characteristics, they've got ears, they've got a snout.
Yeah.
It would be, I don't want to say a stretch, but yeah, maybe if you saw it humped over and you just saw the back of it, you could maybe misinterpret it.
Yeah, if you see something walking and swinging its arms like a person, that's not a bear. Bears do not walk like that.
So we'll kind of switch topics a little bit, because we've talked about this in the past before, but you pretty much think that they are always hunting, right? I mean, they're pretty much going to hunt everything, right?
Well, they're in search of food most often. Yeah, they do other things also, but that search for food is kind of a big part of their behaviors.
Yeah, I mean, because like we hear reports. Obviously, they hunt deer and so forth, but I mean, there are a lot of reports that you can even go on the BFRO and see how they hunt everything. Like they hunt squirrels, they just eat everything they can. So I guess they're just ultimate predators, I guess.
Yeah, I already knew that. I don't have to look at the BFR website to figure that out, but I mean, sure, they need protein. That's one of their big things. They'll supplement their diet with pretty much anything else, and we've talked about that before.
Yeah.
Another thing that I find interesting is so many reports of these things eating mushrooms and mycelium, the stuff under the duff that, mushrooms, I guess, are just basically the fruit or the flower of the mycelium. And so there's got to be a reason. I don't know how much nutritional value there is, but recently I was listening to a guy who's talking about there's extremely powerful medicinal properties in certain types of mycelium and mushrooms that are not just antibacterial, but they kill viruses. So it's a little bit of a stretch, but I'm just going out on a limb here. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or
Well, lots of wild creatures, eat things for medicinal purposes. Like when you see a cat eating grass, that's usually in a good indication they have an upset stomach, and that usually either induces vomiting or whatever is in the grass helps them, get over those stomach problems. Same with dogs. Dogs do the same thing. But there's lots of animals that will eat things, for their medicinal purposes. Not unusual.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. And these are very intelligent creatures, so they would, if a cat or a dog knows to do that, these things probably many times more have that
and we talk
capability.
We talk about other forms of evidence. That's another one. And I found this a few times where I find finger marks in clay. I have one place I found and photographed, and again, these are in my latest book. Two incidents that were very interesting. One, I found a place that was very remote, and you could see it was no other animal. It had to have something with hands, and it was like it took its hand. If you were taking your left hand with your thumb up, so the backside with the small finger was down, and you would scrape away the surface duff on the ground, exposing the clay underneath, and then you could see 4 finger marks dragged in the clay. And another incident, when I was with our guest Lee, the first time when I went up to look at the place where he had his encounters, I found a very fresh place where, again, 4 big fingers had been drug about 3 to 4 feet through the clay near this creek that was almost dried up. And when we talked to our anthropologist friend John, he said, wasn't surprised. He said that a lot of primates will eat clay for the minerals. And other animals do the same thing. And you see, of course, cows and horses with salt and mineral licks. So it's not uncommon that animals will seek out those minerals to supplement their dietary needs.
Oh, interesting. And I just want to go real quick. So those handprints or the fingerprints that you saw, they're huge, right? They're large enough that they could not be mistaken for a human.
No, the finger markings were they were close to 2 inches across.
Okay, yeah. And they do this, so if they have a deficiency, a mineral deficiency, then that's how they supplement it.
Yes, and it's not uncommon among primates.
Well, we'll also remember, we talked to Tammy a few weeks ago, and remember how she said that she saw like one of these creatures like slam a fish? I mean, they will definitely eat anything for protein. I think you're right.
Yeah, well, she said did she see it, or did she heard the splash, like somebody slapped its hand on the water?
She heard it. I think she heard it, but it was definitely a splash against the water. So.
Yeah, it was a powerful, very, very powerful splash that you could actually feel it. And that's where I want to kind of go back. We got a follow-up email to that episode from a field biologist who explained that this thing may have very well seen the fish hit the water with a very powerful splash of that log or whatever, stun the fish, and then there it's got its food source. And again, it goes back to two things. Number one, the behavior. What is the reason behind that behavior? Now you got a good explanation. And number two, food. If you can't remember anything else, it's food. These things are looking for.
Yeah, when you're looking at behaviors, if it's something is reported to be kind of strange, think about it searching for food. Does that fit what it was doing? Because remember, when we hear witness accounts, it's just a small window into the overall behavior of what's going on in that area. So a lot of times there's many questions about what's going on, but those are just very small glimpses into the overall thing that's happening there.
Hey, well, I have a follow-up question to that. Did the Native American stories throughout the 1400s to the 1500s to the 1700s, did they ever change or evolve, or were these creatures always the same?
They were always the same, and it's really no different than the stories we hear from non-native peoples afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question, Brian. That's one that I've always found fascinating, is the consistency, whether the story is 2 years old, 2 days old, 200 years old.
Or 1,000
the
miles
behaviors
apart.
Yeah. It's the consistency of their behavior. It's always interesting.
Yeah, when people argue that, well, these things can't be real, you can't fake that consistency, over geography or time. So that's a huge argument in favor, as opposed to people, making these claims, it can't be real.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's what we talked to Tony about, the debunkers out there who basically they're trying to prove a negative point. And he was saying in a court of law, that just doesn't work. You can't go in and say, well, we don't have any evidence. So a lack of evidence is not evidence of lack.
Right, and it's not that we have a lack of evidence. We have plenty of evidence. Unfortunately, it's tried in the court of public opinion, which really has no value.
So, obviously, you're probably the biggest expert on this entire subject, but has your perspective changed a little bit between, let's say, like the 1970s to now? I mean, have you, developed any, changes to your philosophy or perspective? Or
Well, I guess, first of all, I don't like being called an expert. I don't think anybody in this subject should be called an expert.
You are.
Being knowledgeable, sure. Being an expert, I shy away from those kind of titles. Attitudes, well, your attitude should change, and perspective should change, because if you were continually gathering new material and assessing that material based on what you've previously known, your opinions and outlooks should continually change, and mine have.
Mm-hmm. I mean, have your opinion changed on like Renee or John Green or anything like that? Or
well, early on, I didn't know anything about the subject. So when I met those guys, my knowledge of them at the time was they were the world's most knowledgeable people, and they were. But when I moved past what they knew, then I realized they were very limited in what they knew. So yes, that opinion changed.
And collectively, I would have to say it seems like the general overall understanding of the topic has evolved. We've learned more and more. So over the past, 50 years?
It has changed, not always in a good way, because there's so much garbage out there. I mean, it's the subject is permeated with junk.
It's unfortunate.
So when people first coming in looking at it, and I meet so many people that are, they've had, for whatever reason, they come into the topic and they start looking, and there are people out there who sound good and they look good in what they're doing, but in reality are total junk. They're very unknowledgeable people. You can put a bow around a turd, it's still a turd.
Well, and I think a lot of the so-called experts out there are really nothing more than bottom feeders on the internet, and then again, and even if they've had an encounter or two, a lot of what they're putting out there is opinion and not based on fact.
Yeah, there are plenty. I've encountered over the years plenty of these people who've had an encounter or two, and instantly they think they're an expert. Or they'll meet somebody that's prominent in the subject, and automatically think they're an expert. It's a very distasteful kind of a situation, but, that's why for many years I just sort of stayed away from all of this and kept doing my work, kept plugging along, because of so much of this kind of stuff that's gone on. And people will come along and use and abuse you if they can.
Yeah. Well, that actually is another question I was going to ask. How frustrated are you with some of these hoaxers out there, some of the people that are making tons of money off of this stuff, and that that they're a fraud?
Oh, I'm completely fed up with it.
Yeah.
That's why, that is the main reason I do not consider myself part of the Bigfoot community, because I'm just fed up with all of it.
Yeah, I mean, even the BFRO, I mean, they probably have good intentions, but you can tell a lot of the people there are just kind of fraud,
Well, there's a lot of good people everywhere, but, I don't, like Renee DeHinden, he used to tell me, organizations are terrible, stay away from them. And I completely understand his thinking on that. Because, in this subject, there are people that'll sell their grandmothers for information, and they're friends one minute and they're enemies the next, and it's just a quagmire, the whole thing.
Yeah.
So did we have any more listener questions, or?
I think we got one or two more here. That said, okay, so, and again, this one comes from Chad. So Chad, keep them coming. He's got a lot of good questions. Are there any reliable artist renderings? And I like this. This is a good question. Of a Sasquatch face. Maybe a picture that isn't blurry. What do these things really look like? So how would you describe, because you've seen them, how close are these artist renderings to what you know or what you've seen?
The best artist renderings we have are from our friend Justin Mark. And his work is in conjunction with close eyewitness accounts, working with the witnesses. And a couple of his images, and you'll see them, folks, on YouTube on our cards on the different videos, especially the more recent ones, the ones that say, artwork by Justin Mark. I can't tell you how many witnesses we've had will send me an email and say, that is the closest I've ever seen. It looked almost identical to what I saw. So take a look at some of his images, and I guess, Tom, we can probably put those on the website as well. But,
absolutely.
But yeah, there's lots of images out there, and I look at things, especially on Facebook occasionally, and I saw one this morning. I thought, oh God, that's terrible. It looked nothing like, it's just people have these concepts they come up with, and I've had artists send me works that, and it's interesting. I have one from a very professional artist, and it's a very good rendition. It looks very much, you would say, oh, that looks a lot like a gorilla, but you look at Justin's, one of his more recent works, and it looks very close to that. And that was him working with some of our, really good witnesses that had really good detail, very close to her rendition. So when you get a number of those, you can say, okay, that's pretty doggone close. And it looks like what I saw as well.
And just to follow up on that, a lot of the cards that we're putting up recently are Justin's, his hand drawings, his artwork. So, and Justin, if you're listening, thank you. Very good artwork, and we always cite you as the artist for that. If you got any more, send them our way. We love them. They're great.
Yeah, we were, as Justin has time, he's been working on the types, so we can get some visuals out there for people to see of the different variations or types of these creatures. So it's a work in progress. He has his own job that he's doing, so when he has time, he works on this project, but it's slowly evolving.
All right. Now we've got a question here, and this is from a gentleman named Justin, not Justin Mark, but a different Justin. His question is, besides the Patty film, are there other videos that you've seen that you think are credible, maybe even some of them posted online?
There's only a couple that come to mind that I think are legit. One specifically, and we've mentioned this a few times, and I can't think the source. It was some folks who pulled over in Canada. You know the one I'm talking about, Tom, where there's snow on the ground, it's near a body of water, and the thing gets up and walks away.
Yes, I do.
And in my opinion, I think that's legitimate.
Well, and part of it is you listen to the response of the people that are witnessing it. It's unrehearsed, it's spontaneous, and I think you even have a little kid in there, which you can't really get kids to rehearse something like that. It was very authentic.
Now, I guess my question would be is how they knew it was there to begin with to start videoing that. That would be the only con to that particular video, but I don't know what happened prior to that, why they stopped, and maybe they could see it, 'cause sometimes you can see things when you're actually at a location that you don't necessarily see on a video, especially if it was done with a phone.
Yeah, that's true. And, and that goes towards the evidence as well. Some of the footprints that I've found, you take a look at it and you're like, wow, there's no doubt about it. That's a footprint. But when you take a picture of it, your eyes, you got two eyes, they're separated. You're seeing 3D. You're seeing a 3D rendering of what's really there. But a camera doesn't. Camera gives you kind of a two-dimensional. And unless the sun angle is just right and hitting it kind of sideways, you don't get the full effect. And you hear this a lot, right? Where people say, well, here's a picture of, and it could be anything, but it just doesn't do it justice. And that's, would you agree that's kind of the reason why what we see is not quite the same what the camera sees?
Something I learned from Renee DeHinden a long time ago, we talked about photographing things. And he says, you can't just go take a picture of something and off you go. Sometimes you have to wait hours so the lighting conditions are right to actually get that image in the picture. And he was correct. I mean, I can tell you there was a line of beautiful, really large black bear tracks when I was in the field up north of here a few years back. And I thought, well, I'll take some pictures because they're really great tracks. They were in river sand next to the Klamath River. But I had to wait like 2 hours for the sun to be right because you couldn't see them. Now, standing there, you could see it, but looking at it through the lens of the camera, they weren't practically invisible because of the lighting, the light-colored sand, that what I'm talking about, the kind of a heavy grained sand. It's kind of gray. The tracks were beautiful. They would have made great casts. I didn't cast them because I had a lot of them already from that area. But even getting down on the ground and trying to look across, to get the right angle, didn't work. I had to wait till there was some shadowing on them to get a good picture. So sometimes with field work, you have to be very patient, especially photographing, just to get the right light to get that picture so people can actually see what you're seeing.
Exactly. And I kind of go back to the footprints that I found late this summer. We found them. We were in a very, to say remote is an understatement, but my buddy and I were out there, and there was no way he was going to stick around, and I wasn't too excited either, because we're just surrounded by all this leafy stuff, and I'd say our max visibility was 15 feet. It could be 5 feet in some areas with all the forest around us. So, we weren't able to stick around for a few hours for the sun angle to get just right to take better pictures. We're like, okay, these work. We're out of here. Just a comment.
Oh, yeah, right. But
hey, so
go ahead.
Will, can you comment a little bit more on the field work? I mean, how much effort that goes involved with that?
Well, of course, it's a great deal of time spent doing it. First of all, you've got to choose your location and the reason you're choosing a location. And sometimes let's go back to the beginning, I guess. First of all, if you're in some of these locations and they're huge areas, just learning how to navigate through those places can be very time consuming.
It's a lot of premeditation.
It's a lot of preparation ahead of time because you have to have. Now I'll give you an example. One of the areas I go to, I use 7.5 minute series quad maps, topographic maps, and one area alone has about 35 of those for that area. So you're not just using you can't use GPS to get into those places. There's no signal in those places. So, and you're covering large sections of land just to get to those places you want to go to. So you have to learn. You have to know how to read a map, topographic map, and then you have to navigate. Be sure you're on the right roads, things like that. So, just getting to places can be very time consuming. Driving from where I live is about 5 hours away to the entrance to those places. Then you've got to navigate to where it is you want to go to. So then you're talking about conducting searches of an area to find evidence. Mm-hmm. And you might go 100 times in an area and not find anything. So there's huge amounts of time, and you can consider it wasted time. It's really not, because that teaches you something also. Because the 100th time you might find something in the area, so that teaches you, it could be where they are at that particular time in the range. So you have to learn those patterns. And then when you find things, it depends on what you find. Let's say you find a line of tracks.
Exactly.
To properly document that line of tracks, again, like we were talking about lighting, depending on what the tracks are in, you might not get great pictures until the timing is right. Then there's documentation of those prints. You know, you always hear people everybody uses the word stride. You know, everybody uses it incorrectly. What they're talking about is step. It's the distance between what footprint and the next consecutive footprint. That's step. Stride is the arc swing of one leg. So if it's the right foot, it's the next consecutive right foot. That's stride. And it's measured either from heel to heel or toe to toe. You know, people need to learn that properly, because it's an incorrect measurement if you're calling the space, you know, between let's say the big toe, the end of the big toe of the right footprint, and then the heel of the next left footprint. You know, that's just spacing. That's not step or stride. So you need to measure at least 3 of those if you're talking about step or stride, and you should do both to get a correct average, at least 3 of those. So that's very time consuming, doing all that stuff. And then you have to count the prints. You know, you pick the first print, might be the first one you find. What I do, I consider that the 0 footprint. That's your baseline. And then from that forward is, you know, +1 and so on until you don't find any more. And then you go back to the 0 footprint and do it backwards. So you want to get a total count on the footprints, and then the direction they're going, and all of that stuff. So there's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah.
And that's just footprints.
You know, that's interesting. Yeah, right. But that's good information to know, because if anything less than that, you know, if you're doing it incorrectly, your data is skewed. It's not useful at that point.
Well, there's a lot of
or
stuff
less than useful.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff people put out that's just plain crap, because and I've seen it so many times where somebody will go and they'll be put on a line of tracks. One individual in particular, you know, Renee DeHinden, I don't know where I was gone. So he had this other person go on this track find, and there were, I don't know, he cast 12 footprints. And I questioned him about it afterwards. I said, well, did you count the prints? Nope. Did you follow them? Nope. Did you go back where they came from to see where it was coming from? Nope. All the guy was interested in was having some footprints, and he called himself an expert afterwards. Information was pretty much useless as far as I was concerned.
You know, that's so. And you've got a book. I've got your book that goes into detail on. It's not notes from the field, but jog my memory. I have a good memory, but it's short.
Was it Bigfoot Fieldwork 101?
Yeah, that's the one.
And that's your foundation. That's just the basics you need.
Yeah, but it's a good starting point, and you go into detail how to measure step and stride and all of that in there. And I want to back up again. You said something that I always find interesting, and I think it's so important. A lot of people rely on their electronic devices, whether it's a phone or a GPS. But you know what? And those are good. Don't get me wrong. I use them as well, and they have a place. But nothing beats 2 things. Number one, topo map of the area. You know, typically you can go to a ranger station and get. They're called 7.5 minute maps. 1 to 24,000 is the scale that they're in. Here's the thing: map and compass, and take a class. You know, REI has great classes. They're fairly inexpensive on how to use map and compass. It does a couple things. Number one, if the electronics fail, you've got a backup. But the other thing is you got the big picture, and you simply can't get that with a GPS or electronic device. You can sit down at your leisure. You can study an area, and once you understand the contour lines and, you know, all the other data that's in a map, so important.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, if you're doing,
there's some things that technology do that are a little bit misleading. So you have to have a map and a topographic map to really see what's going on, to understand what's there. So And again, most places, if you're in a place you're seriously researching these things, they're going to be where you're not going to get a signal.
Exactly. And the other thing that the topographic map will show you is this a good area to look in? Do I need to avoid this? Obstacles, and I'll just say that your typical, the best and the most commonly used topographic maps for hiking, again, is the 7.5 minute, also known as the 1 to 24,000 scale. Their contour lines are 40 feet. Okay, so from one contour line to the next, that represents a 40-foot area. If you have a ravine that's 35 feet, it's not going to show up in there. So just, be careful.
Right. Yeah, you have to understand what those markings mean and pay close attention to it, because you can get in a lot of trouble, if you don't in those places.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we're getting kind of close on our time, fellas, so any final thoughts or questions before we wrap this session up?
I just want to thank everybody who sent in their questions. And again, you can reach us real easy, just questions at creekdevil.com. If you've had an encounter or if you have a question, send it there and we'll get to it. So thank you.
Brian, anything final?
No, just same thing as what Tom said. Just thanks for everybody that's supporting us, and send us any encounters that you may have had, and thanks, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everyone, and thanks for listening. Stay tuned for the third segment with Jim's narration, and we'll be back next week, folks.
Welcome. This story is being brought to you by William Jevning and is being narrated by me, Jim Sower. The title of this story: Clue to Gorilla Men Found May Be Lost Race of Giants. July 16th, 1924. The Siatic, Siatko, and other spelling variations. Klallam Indians tell of 8-foot Siatics who killed game by hypnotism. Existence kept secret by other tribes. Hoquiam, Washington. Mountain devils discovered at Mount St. Helens near Kelso are none other than the Siatic tribe, said George Totsky, Klallam tribe editor of The Real American, an Indian National Weekly publication, in an interview here today. Siatic is a Klallam pronunciation. All other tribes pronounce it Siatko. The Indians of the Northwest have kept the existence of the Siatics a secret, partly because they know no white man would believe them, and the Indian, known for his honesty and truthfulness, does not like to be called a liar, and partly because the Northwestern Indian is ashamed of the Siatic tribe, said Totsky. The Mountain Devils, or guerrillas who bombarded the prospector's shack on Mount St. Helens in 1924, according to the description of the miners, are none other than the Siatic tribe, with whom every Indian in the Northwest is familiar, said Totsky. Were thought to be extinct. The Siatics were last heard of by the Klallam Indians about 15 years ago, approximately 1899 to 1909, and it was believed by the present-day Indians that they had become extinct. The Siatic tribe also made their home in caves, in the heart of the wilderness on Vancouver Island and in the Olympic Range, in particular Mount St. Helens. As described by the Klallam Indians, the Siatics are 7 to 8 feet tall. They have hairy bodies like the bear. They are great hypnotists and kill their game by stunning them with hypnotic power. They also have a gift of ventriloquism, throwing their voices at great distances, and can imitate any bird in the Northwest. They have a very keen sense of humor, Totsky added. In the past generations, they stole many Indian women and Indian babies. They lived entirely in the mountain, coming down to the shores only when they wanted a change of diet. The Quinaults claimed that they generally came once a year to the Quinault River, about fall. The Clallams say they favored the river area near Brinnan on Hood Canal. After having their fill of fresh salmon, they stole dried salmon from the Indian women. The Siatic tribe are harmless if left alone. The Clallam tribe, however, at one time several generations ago, killed a young man of the Siatic tribe to their everlasting sorrow, for they killed off a whole branch of the Clallam tribe but one, and he was merely left to tell the tale to the other Clallams up sound. The Clallam Indians believed that the Siatic tribe had become extinct. It is 15 years since their tracks were last seen and recognized at the Brennan River. Prior to that time, many Clallam Indians have met and talked with men of this strange tribe, for the Siatics talk the strange tongue of the Clallams, which is said to have originated from the bear tongue. The Quinault Indians, however, claim that Fred Pope of the Quinault tribe and George Hyasman of the Satsop tribe were fishing about 15 miles up the Quinault River in the month of September 4 years ago, 1920, when they were visited by the Siatics. The two Indians had caught a lot of steelhead trout, which they had left in their canoe, and the Siatics stole these. Henry Napoleon of the Clallam tribe is the only Indian who has ever been invited to the home of the Siatic tribe. It was while Napoleon was visiting relatives on the British Columbia coast about 30 years ago, that would have made the year roughly 1895, that he met a Siatic while hunting. The giant Indian then invited him to their home, which is in the very heart of the wilderness of Vancouver Island. Napoleon claims that they live in a large cave. He was treated with every courtesy and told some of their secrets. He claims that the giant Indians made themselves invisible by strange medicine that they rub over their bodies, and that they were able to cause great fear by hypnotic power, and had the gift of ventriloquism, to mimic the owl and throw their voices. Some Indians claim that during the process of evolution, when the Indian was changing from animal to man, the Siatic did not fully absorb the Tamanois, or soul power, and thus he became an anomaly in the process of evolution. The Indians of the Northwest are of the belief that the mountain devils found at Mount St. Helens are indeed the Siatic Indians, and it is generally their custom to frighten persons who have displeased them by throwing rocks at them. This is the end of the story. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open out there.